Hello and welcome back to the Gluten Free RN podcast. I'm Nadine, the Gluten Free RN. Today, during episode 52, we're going to review a few things. So it's Going Gluten Free for Good is the title of this episode of the Gluten Free RN podcast. Stay tuned. Hi, I'm Nadine, the Gluten Free RN. Thank you very much for joining me for episode 52 of Going Gluten Free for Good. I'd like to welcome everybody from around the world that is listening to the Gluten Free RN podcast. Interestingly enough, almost 20% of the people that are listening are outside of the United States. There are listeners from the United Kingdom, Canada, Australia, Guernsey, Germany, the United Arab Emirates, Japan, South Africa, Bahamas, India, Qatar, and Guatemala, just to name a few. I'd like to welcome everyone that is listening to the Gluten Free RN podcast from around the world, especially the new listeners. I hope that you are finding this interesting and informative. Please leave a rating or a review on iTunes, Stitcher, or anywhere that you listen to this podcast. It helps other people find the Gluten Free RN podcast and also have access to this information. Spread the love. Let other people know that this is available and it's a free resource. What does going gluten-free for good mean? It means going gluten-free totally, 100%, zero gluten, and for the rest of your life, because it is for good. It is for the good of your health, for the good of your family, for your short-term and long-term health. But what does that really mean to you? What does it mean to your family, for your short-term and for your long-term health? And how can you successfully transition or maintain a gluten-free diet? We're going to go over some of these things and we're going to review them again today. I know we've talked about them in the past, but every time I do a podcast, I'm reminded of how many things I forget to mention during the actual recording of the podcast. Oh, there's so much more than what I actually talk about during the podcast. It's amazing. And I'm thinking, oh, how could I have forgotten to say that? Or I'm really going to have to do an addendum or another episode just based on specific topics because there's so much more information. And before the year changes, I want to review the information that we've been talking about right along and really how and why it's so important to go gluten-free for good. The thing is that gluten is addictive, and many people are addicted to the proteins in gluten. Those proteins, the gliadin protein and the gluten proteins, and probably other ones, actually bind to our opioid receptors in our brains and in our bodies. So it is addicting. Food is somewhat cheap depending on where you live, but certainly the things that are cheap fillers, such as the wheat, barley, rye, which are the gluten grains, those are cheap and readily available. So you can go in any grocery store or convenience store or gas station, many different places all around the world, and find wheat. It's very difficult to avoid it sometimes because it really is everywhere. But more and more over time, it is slowly being replaced by many gluten-free products or paleo-type products or fresh fruits and vegetables, whole foods, very easily prepared foods that don't contain any cheap fillers. And really, that is what we're trying to avoid, is the cheap fillers. So anything, including rice and corn, I like to think of them as subsidized foods. I stopped eating any foods that are subsidized by the United States government anyway, quite a few years ago. Those are going to be your cheap filler foods and the foods that are genetically modified or heavily sprayed with Roundup, the ones that are less optimal for my health and potentially dangerous for my health. So I recognize very early on that gluten is addicting. It's cheap. It's everywhere. And it's readily available to people. It's almost hard to avoid. But now that we know, now that we've had this huge paradigm shift of what is real food and what is cheap filler food, it's easier to recognize it and easier to avoid it. Keeping in mind that it is addictive. So many of us have to go through this whole detox process, and we'll talk about what a detox process is and why it's different for everyone. So let's just say that you've just found out that you have to be on a gluten-free diet, or you just got a diagnosis of celiac disease proper, or one of your family members got diagnosed with celiac disease, and so therefore the entire household is going gluten-free in support of that person, and also to make sure that they're not cross-contaminated or contaminated with gluten that would still be in the house. Because we all know that we are what we eat. It is very important to recognize that if you're eating cheap fillers and very little food that is nutrient dense, especially if you have a malabsorptive disorder such as celiac disease or any other intestinal damage, you are what you eat. And it's very hard for your body to operate optimally if you are not eating nutrient dense foods or supplementing for some of us, which is necessary, at least for a period of time. So you are what you eat. Be very respectful of your body and recognize that if you're putting essentially junk food, and there's a reason we call it junk food, into your body, and that's all you're eating, then you can expect that at some point your body will stop trying to compensate and stop trying to maintain health because there's nothing else your body can do. It's going to fall apart and not work as well as you would like. And you're going to get sick. So as a nurse, of course, I love it when we can avoid people getting sick in the first place. That's called preventative medicine. Let's talk about the detoxing process because it is different for everyone. And usually a good question people ask is, how long will this detoxing process last for me? Well, the detoxing process is different for everyone. When my daughter went gluten-free, she felt better within 24 hours. She's like, oh my gosh, I don't have belly pain anymore. But for most of us, it is a process, which means there's ups and downs. Some days we feel better. Other days we may feel worse than even when we were eating gluten or whatever we're trying to detox from. There are many different elimination type diets. There are many different ways to detox. Some people will do a Whole30, which I highly recommend so that you can get reestablished with what real food looks like and tastes like. And you're detoxing from sugar and alcohol or whatever else it is that you are contaminating your diet with. An elimination diet is a great way to reboot your entire system. I do recommend the Whole30, or if you're working with a practitioner, work with a practitioner who actually understands that food is medicine and how food actually affects our bodies. Always keep in mind that you may feel worse before you get better. This is a detox, much like any other detox from a narcotic or any alcohol, any substance that is addictive. And we talked about the fact that gluten is addictive. So anytime our food is addictive, we need to recognize that if we take that food out, we will also have detoxing symptoms. And those symptoms vary person to person. They could be headaches or migraines. It could be low energy. You might get your old symptoms coming back. You might feel hungry all of the time. That's very common. A lot of people, when they're in a detox process, will say that they're starving all of the time and they cannot get enough food. And that is concerning to people. I have people that are newly diagnosed celiac or non-celiac gluten sensitivity, or they're going to be on a detox process, I do tell them that this is not about calories or portion sizes, that their bodies are starving due to the damage in the intestines. So it's very important that they just eat food. And the better that food is, nutrition-wise, as far as being nutrient-dense, no gluten, no dairy, and super good high fat, the quicker their bodies will heal and get better. Of course, during this whole elimination time, it would be a good idea to take a super good, high quality, gluten-free, of course, multivitamin, or work on the deficiencies that you are aware of. It might be B12, it might be zinc, vitamin D3 might be low. So it's very important to start working on those as you're in this detox process. I've had several conversations over this last week with people where they've said, well, I'm sort of gluten-free most of the time, but I'm not very careful, or I don't get symptoms, so I really don't know if I get gluten or not. I think the people that are not having any symptoms with a gluten exposure are at a disadvantage because they truly do not know if they are getting glutened or not. And if they're getting glutened over time, their intestinal damage or damage to other organs may continue because all it takes is a breadcrumb or a dusting of flour or any exposure to gluten, even in shared fryers where the oil is used for not just French fries, but maybe something covered in breadcrumbs. Those breadcrumbs and the gluten that are in them are heat stable up to a very high temperature. So those proteins do not actually get denatured by the super hot oil or any hot surface area. So any surface area that has things like soy sauce in them or breadcrumbs or beer batter, any of those things can cause cross-contamination very easily or an actual contamination. It is certainly not okay to cheat on a gluten-free diet. Keeping in mind that it doesn't hurt me or your neighbor or anyone else but you and the people that are directly related to you and have to live with you. Because it might make you angry, it might make you sick, you might be in the bathroom for hours. Those things do affect the people that we live with and that love us. So do be aware that if you're cheating on your gluten-free diet or intentionally eating gluten, that does not just affect you, although it does affect you directly. There's a ripple effect. And we know that gluten can stay in your system for a long time. You may only experience symptoms for a couple hours or a couple days, but the reality is that gluten can trigger autoimmune issues that can last for weeks or months. So it's very important that you are vigilant about avoiding gluten or any cross-contamination. For a long time, I could tell that I was having symptoms for up to 10 weeks after a gluten exposure. That's 2.5 months. So all it would take for me not to get better or for my intestines to stay damaged would be 4 unintentional gluten exposures a year. Under those circumstances, it's extremely important that I avoid gluten like the plague, because that's what it is. And I do recommend that people not use the defense, I'll say that they're not as sensitive as I am or someone else is. I would say always default to the fact that if a person is sensitive and they're the canary in the coal mine, that you should also be that careful or that cautious, because you're getting the same gluten exposures or more by not being careful, or not communicating at a restaurant, or just having that one piece of the cake that has gluten in it. So you do need to be careful, because even that breadcrumb will cause the same autoimmune response, the same cascade of symptoms. What are the main causes of cross-contamination? And do keep in mind that the current United States standard is less than 20 parts per million. And we have talked about why that might just not be enough. Australia has a standard of 0% or 0 parts per million of gluten. And I do recommend that we do try to attain that for ourselves. I've explained why 20 parts per million is perhaps not enough, and gluten at 20 parts per million certainly can accumulate over time or even over a day. So possible places of cross-contamination would be anything processed, any food that you do not have control over the process. So when I get raw foods or fresh fruits and vegetables, I can process them in my kitchen. I can boil the apples for applesauce or the quince. I can make quince sauce and applesauce and tomato sauce. I can do those things in my kitchen. But when someone else does them, there is a risk of cross-contamination, especially if the foods are processed in a facility that also processes wheat. It's very difficult to get wheat out of the air. It's in the air for up to 72 hours in a facility that also processes wheat. And what happens to wheat flour when you add water to it? It turns to paste. Do you remember making paper mache as a child or even as an adult? Basically, you put flour and water and use newspaper. And what I remember is making paper mache balloons so that we could make decorations for things or whatnot. So that paper mache was actually wheat paste that became glue for that newspaper to adhere to the balloon. Then you pop the balloon and you end up with a nice decoration. I would never do that again, of course. My paper mache days with wheat flour are over. That would certainly be a risk of contamination. So anything processed, fresh fruits and vegetables need to be washed. Bulk bins, I always caution people about getting their food from bulk bins because if you've ever watched a bulk bin area, just go look. Children will go in and scoop different things out of different bins. Sometimes adults will. And really, if you talk to the people in the bulk bin food area, they will say they don't necessarily clean those bins between putting different things in them. So there can be a wheat containing bulk item in one of those bins. And if they then put in a gluten-free flour or oatmeal or something, that product is then contaminated. Interestingly enough, in the co-ops locally to where I live, they have a grinder in the bulk food area that grinds wheat into flour. So that whole area is then contaminated because we did say that that wheat flour is in the air for up to 72 hours, and that's per the FDA. So do try to keep that in mind, and that wheat flour will settle on everything like a fine dust, and that dust is a contaminant. So while our friends and family love us, they are also a potential cross-contamination risk, either from kissing or trying to feed us gluten-free products that aren't really gluten-free. Restaurants tend to be pretty good, but it's always dicey. I like to say that it's like playing Russian roulette. Gluten-free in restaurants does not always mean gluten-free, if you know what I mean. And if you go out at all, you will know that a lot of restaurants have taken to writing gluten-free items on their menu with a GF as a designation. There's many restaurants that do this. Are those menu items really gluten-free? Sometimes yes, and sometimes no. Restaurants are not very careful sometimes about the gluten issue. They like to have those items on the menu. Usually they'll have a disclaimer that says, there is gluten in our kitchen. Please be aware of that, but we're very careful, and our staff is educated about what it means to be gluten-free. So if your waitress or waiter knows what gluten-free is and celiac disease, they're going to be better communicators to the staff in the back, to the chefs, to the people that are actually making your food. And keep in mind that that communication line has to be very clear. So restaurants can be dicey, and even if you go to a restaurant and you have, let's just say, 20 great experiences where you do not get hit with gluten, there is the possibility every time you go out that could change. So just be aware. Don't be afraid to go out, but do be aware and make your choices of your restaurants very carefully. Another place that you have to be aware of cross-contamination is your own home. So yes, kissing can be a cause of contamination or cross-contamination. Cutting boards, especially if they're wood or plastic and they have nicks in them, they will harbor the gluten protein. Hands are an unfortunate way of cross-contamination, especially hands that aren't washed after they touch anything with gluten. Dog food, and I did an entire podcast on why our pets, our dogs and our cats, should be gluten-free, if not paleo. But dog food is a very common cross-contaminant, especially if the dog or the cat is eating gluten food and licking children or licking you even. That could very easily be a source of contamination. Cat litter is increasingly a wheat product, or there's some wheat in there. So airborne gluten from the kitty litter or cleaning it or having it in your house, and the cat is in the litter box on that wheat and then walking all over your house. So do be aware of animals and cross-contamination risk. Any utensils would need to be changed out. Things like wooden spoons, wooden utensils, those need to be changed out just with new wooden spoons or new wooden utensils. Ovens, toasters most assuredly, and containers of food such as peanut butter or nut butters, mayonnaise, anything that someone in your house might spread on bread and then put the knife back in, butter, cheeses, anything that is spread on bread or put on crackers is a contamination risk. You need to be a really good food detective and read labels if you're going to buy foods that don't adhere to my rule. My rule is the food that I buy typically has 5 ingredients or less, and I must be able to picture what every ingredient is. So I know what a cashew is, I know what a dried cranberry looks like, but I have no idea what hydrolyzed vegetable protein is, or natural seasonings, or natural flavorings. Anytime I have to ask, gee, what do you think that is? Or what is it made out of? That product goes immediately back up on the shelf. I'm just not going to buy it, and I'm certainly not going to waste my time calling 1-800 numbers. So wheat-free does not mean gluten-free. Certainly there can be barley or rye in those products. You have to be very careful about knowing what ingredients are. So any subfamily of wheat, triticale, spelt, those are all in the family of wheat. So learn those other names. If you have a certification process in your country or where you live, buy products that are certified gluten-free. But more and more, I am seeing food items that are labeled gluten-free that do in fact contain wheat. Ooh, and it's maddening. It's very difficult to make an educated decision based on a certification process if in fact they're going to include some form of wheat, usually wheat starch, which I'm opposed to, or any other grain-derived component. So I want my products to be 100% grain-free. And for some of you, that's going to include things like millet or buckwheat, but you do have to make sure there's no cross-contamination and that those products are in fact gluten-free. If they're processed with wheat in the same facility, there is a very good chance that those products are not gluten-free, despite what the certification says. So it gets tricky. That's why I am very careful now about how I read labels and what I'm willing to spend my money on, because I don't want to spend a lot of money on a gluten-free product or a product that says it's gluten-free, only to find out that it is manufactured in a facility that processes wheat or that it has some derivative of a grain in it. And this is the time where I'd like to remind you just to eat whole foods. There's no such thing as cheap food. You have to pay for it somewhere. So try to eliminate processed foods, eat local, fresh, organic produce and meat as much as possible, and do recognize that food is medicine. There was a time in my life before I found out I had celiac disease where I would spend a lot of money in the pharmacy and on over-the-counter products and thick wool socks or anything that would increase the circulation in my feet and my hands because I was cold all the time. I would get thick sweaters because I was cold all the time. None of that happens to me anymore. I don't have to treat a lot of symptoms with over-the-counter medication. I am not always searching for things that are going to try to fix my symptoms. I just don't even have those symptoms anymore. So use food as medicine. And I spend a fair amount of money on my food, but I don't have to spend money on any of the other quick fixes or anything else that would treat a symptom. While you're going through the detox process or while you're trying to heal your intestines, there's a good chance you're going to have to take some additional vitamins or supplements. Do make sure that they're in fact gluten-free. There are several brands I like, and I do like Country Life vitamins because they are in fact certified gluten-free. They're readily available and they're relatively inexpensive, so just about anyone has access to them. Or find a practitioner that has a high-quality gluten-free supplement line that they carry. And your practitioners might recommend that you do in fact take some high-quality vitamins and nutrients, things to get you better faster. Because you may have had malnutrition or malabsorption, it's going to be very important that you, in fact, have some additional support with the addition of vitamins and supplements so that your body can heal faster and more completely. So consider a multivitamin, a high-quality fish oil, pre- and probiotics, certainly vitamin D3, and I would recommend getting a level and making sure that your level of vitamin D3 is somewhere between 50 and 100. That's what we're shooting for. Make sure you're taking your vitamin D3 with fat, with a super good high quality fat. Also have your zinc level checked and your B6 and B12 levels checked. And if you find that despite taking your vitamin B6 and B12, you're still low or you're having a lot of symptoms, consider getting your MTHFR gene tested to see if you're a gene carrier for MTHFR. We can do an entire episode on the impact of being an MTHFR gene carrier and how that affects the methylation process. But for right now, let's go back to the additional vitamins and supplements, which I like the liquid form initially while people are healing because the vitamins and minerals would be bioavailable, chewable vitamins, and capsules. I do tell people to avoid anything in tablet form at this point because our bodies are going to have a hard time breaking those tablets down and utilizing any of the potential nutrients in them. So stick with a liquid or chewable or capsules at this point. Ideally, we're going to get our vitamins from food. So eat a nutrient-dense variety of foods that include green leafy vegetables, carrots, yams, fruits, and eggs. And that's for the beta-carotene so that our body can actually make vitamin A. Vitamin B complex things to eat would be protein foods, such as red meat, fruits and vegetables, bone broth. You can get vitamin C from fruits and vegetables, but we're going to do a whole episode on vitamin C coming up and why it's so important. Vitamin D, most of us will have to supplement with a high-quality vitamin D3 supplementation, but you can get that from fish and a couple other food products. And of course, the sunshine. Green leafy vegetables, again, are extremely important in our diet. And eggs, if you can eat them, some people are cross-reactive to eggs, so you have to find that out. But do eat a varied diet so that you make sure that you're getting really good nutrients from the food itself. And those nutrients, the vitamins and the minerals from food are much more bioavailable, which means our body can utilize them more easily. It will take longer in the beginning to grocery shop. If you want to call 1-800 numbers to check on products, make sure you take your phone with you. Plan menus before you go. Bring a grocery list. Bring a safe list. Try never to buy from bulk, and always read labels. It will get easier. One of the things that I found, there are entire grocery stores that I avoid, mostly because they don't have enough of the products I need to make it worthwhile to go in them in the first place. So I stick with the local co-ops, farmers markets, natural grocers. I stick with the stores that I know that I can walk in and find a multitude of things on my list or things that I need to buy. So I'm not just going to several stores and buying 1 or 2 items at each store. I can actually go to one store and get the vast majority of what I need to eat healthy. Also try to plan your meals ahead of time. I use a crock pot a lot or the Instant Pot to prepare meals. For breakfast, it's not uncommon for us to have eggs with vegetables and bacon and snack on some almonds or walnuts or cashews during the day if we need to. Lunch might include carrot sticks, cherry tomatoes, celery sticks, egg salad, and dinner would be things like a really nice beef stew, hamburger patties with lots of vegetables and salads, roasted root vegetables this time of year. Just plan ahead. Think about what foods you like. Get a list of safe foods, which I've included Rob Wolf's list of safe foods, especially on a paleo diet, in earlier episodes. That might be something I'll put on this episode so that you actually have a list of foods that are super safe on the paleo list, nutrient dense, and you don't have to really think about it. It's just a reminder that there are lots of good foods to eat. Some helpful tips for you might be to concentrate on what you can eat, not what you can't. Accept that you will be doing more cooking, baking, and meal planning. It might be a steep learning curve for some of you, which is fine. Change can be very good, and if it means the betterment of your health or the health of your family, this is all going to be good. It might not be easy in the beginning. The end result will be positive. Always make extra at dinner so you can eat leftovers for lunch or even for breakfast. Join a support group and stay current on research and food labeling if you're going to read those food labels. Things change for all of us, and we do have to be adaptive. It's very important that we practice a few really important behaviors that are going to help us through this changing process, through this entire process of changing our food and our lifestyles. Keeping in mind that you'll have to go through a detox process, most likely. Any movement that you can do, whether you're doing exercises in your home in the form of yoga, or you're going to a yoga class, whether you're going to walk or hike. I do recommend hiking in nature amongst the trees, get extra sleep or extra rest, because during that resting or sleeping, your body is actually healing. And then use mindfulness. What that means is try not to complain or catch yourself if you see that you are complaining about your current situation. Try to switch negative thoughts into positive thoughts. What this does is it will rewire our brain to be more positive. So really do try to catch yourself if you're having a negative thought or having a thought of woe is me and why did this happen to me. Switch it around and say, I'm really lucky that I found out that I have celiac disease or that I'm changing my diet now because I'm avoiding a lot of the other health issues that could, in fact, crop up as I get older. So be positive for other people too. Be a positive role model for your children and your neighbors and your support group members. The more you can think about this in a positive light, the better off you'll be, your family will be, your friends will see that you're more positive, and it's good for your overall health. This has been a great review of why going gluten-free for good is good. This has been episode 52 of the Gluten Free RN podcast. I want to thank everyone worldwide for listening. I'd also like to thank the podcasting group for editing and producing the Gluten Free RN podcast. The Pulse Media Network is a group of fabulous nurses that are also podcasters. So a shout out to Kevin and Keith and Elizabeth and everyone that is new to the Pulse Media Network. And while I missed the NNBA conference this year in Florida, I know that many of my friends were there, and the National Nurses in Business Association conference next year will be attended hopefully by myself and many other nurses that are nurse entrepreneurs and fabulous people that have a lot to share. So until next episode of the Gluten Free RN, be positive, go gluten-free for good, and take care of your body. Make good choices and enjoy the process. Thank you very much. I'm Nadine Groskowiak, signing out of episode 52. Bye.